Over the past 10 years, I have amassed and studied an enormous amount of information on every possible aspect of global warming, initially to give myself an overview of the whole situation. But this has turned into something much more important. For many years, scientists have been secure in the belief that human activity is the cause of global warming, and they assumed that any changes would happen gradually as carbon emissions and global temperatures rose simultaneously. But there is a growing consensus that they may be wrong. If one looks closely at the increase of so-called greenhouse gases, and in particular that deemed to be the biggest culprit, carbon dioxide, you will find the maximum that man could have contributed amounts to just 0.05% over the past 150 years. That is a tiny amount, especially if you take into account that CO2 comes from Earth by chemical reaction and will return to Earth in a very similar manner. Neither scientists or the media have explained to us that as Earth's polar ice caps melt back, so enormous amounts of carbon dioxide are released into our atmosphere, not only from that trapped within the ice itself, but also from naturally decaying materials exposed by this melting. Most long-term evidence that scientists have collected to substantiate past and present global warming comes primarily from one method, which is air bubbles trapped in ice samples that have been extracted from permanent glaciers on Earth's polar ice caps. These constitute an archive for the reconstruction of global carbon cycles, rendering data for CO2 and temperature levels over the past 400,000 years. This chart, compiled from that data, shows a regular pattern with a reoccurrence of high CO2 levels every 100,000 years or so. We shall now overlay this with a second chart showing the temperature levels over that same period. Both charts show very similar characteristics. It is predominantly these characteristics that understandably misled scientists into believing that so-called greenhouse gases could be the culprit of global warming, and most probably because they had no other plausible explanation for these results. It is evident to me that these peak periods are moving further apart with time. This strongly suggests a process or reaction that is slowing down. It is also obvious by these time factors involved that these previous peak periods could not have been caused by human activity. This creates the question that if CO2 is not the culprit for global warming, what is? As whatever caused these previous temperature increases is sure to be the cause of this present disruption to our planet. During my studies, I stumbled across another very feasible and simple geophysical process that I am certain is causing global warming. It relates in every way to the evidence scientists have collected so far that supports increased global temperatures. But first, I must explain a number of dynamic facts that you may not be aware of. It is a general conception in science that Earth's inner core is an accumulation of iron, and that it rotates at a different speed from its lithosphere or outer layers. So it is very easy to imagine it acting as the armature of a dynamo and creating Earth's varying geomagnetic fields, known as secular variation. The term North and South poles usually refer to the geographic poles, the most northern and southern points on Earth, where Earth's axis of rotation intersects its surface. They are also central to our mapping system. But there are two further sets of poles, these being the magnetic poles and the geomagnetic poles. The magnetic poles are the points on Earth's surface where the Earth's magnetic field points directly downwards. They are also the points where a magnetic compass would direct you. Then there are the geomagnetic poles. These belong to a much weaker magnetic field about which little is known. Few people realize that Earth's magnetic poles are constantly on the move, and over the past 400 years they have traveled some 2,000 kilometers. During the past 2 centuries, Earth's magnetic North Pole has been visited regularly in order to determine its position. James Ross was the first to visit, and in 1831 he confirmed its position at the Boothia Peninsula in the northern part of Canada. Just prior to this time, the magnetic pole slowed, stopped, then gained velocity in a different direction. During that period, the River Thames in London had frozen for 7 years consecutively, and in North America they were using ice yachts to ferry cargo across the Hudson River. Between 1831 and 1904, the magnetic pole moved just 70 kilometers, and during that whole period the Northern Hemisphere was experiencing extremely harsh winters. Almost half a century later, in 1947, 2 Canadian scientists made a visit to the magnetic pole. They found it near Allen Lake in the Prince of Wales Island, showing it had gained velocity and moved some 250 kilometers northwest since those early observations. It continued to increase in velocity until slowing down again in the early 1950s. Scientists call this slowing of the magnetic pole a geomagnetic jerk. Whenever magnetic jerks occur, they coincide with considerable changes in Earth's magnetic field. The winters during this period in the 1950s were extremely cold, and although still navigable, the Thames was again frozen, and for several years people were skating on the river at Richmond. Since 1962, magnetic North Pole surveys have been a regular part of the Magnetic Survey Program carried out by Natural Resources Canada. And apart from a few small jerks that coincide with harsher winters, magnetic north has continued to increase in velocity. In 1972, scientists working alongside NASA recorded the movement of the pole as having a velocity of 9 kilometers a year. Then in April and May of 1994, Larry Newitt of Canada and Charles Barton of Australia conducted a survey to determine the position of the magnetic pole at that time. Working out of Resolute Bay, they found the yearly velocity had increased and was now 15 kilometers a year. But in 2001, Larry's team discovered its velocity had increased to an incredible 40 kilometers a year. They also calculated its potential position in 2005. Recently, I contacted Larry Newitt. He runs the geomagnetic laboratory associated with the Geological Survey of Canada. He is the person responsible for taking measurements of the magnetic North Pole. Larry was unable to get direct measurements in 2005 as bad weather prevented him from reaching the pole, but he did manage to get close enough to take 2 measurements. He says, "It appears as though the pole is further away than expected and is moving even faster than before. It has left Canadian territory and crossed into international waters, probably just passing the 200 nautical mile limit. My instruments and calculations suggest that the magnetic North Pole is accelerating at an enormous rate and may have reached a velocity in excess of 100 kilometers a year already. In my view, if this phenomenon continues with its present increase in velocity and speed, then the magnetic North Pole will be passing the geographic North Pole within the next few years." During my studies, I noticed a correlation between the movement of Earth's magnetic flux and our weather patterns. And studying data on our polar ice caps, it became evident to me that each cap appeared to be melting more on one side than the other. More importantly, the speed and direction of this melting closely shadowed the direction of travel and the velocity of the magnetic poles. The ice cap on the North Pole is melting faster than the South, and the North Magnetic Pole is moving faster than its counterpart. Also evident was that during periods when the magnetic North Pole was moving very slowly, such as a geomagnetic jerk, or a period when the pole changed direction, Earth's winter temperatures would rapidly decrease and its seasons would become much more defined. There is a generally accepted theory that Earth's wind circulation creates its ocean currents. I believe this theory came about because Earth's winds in general move faster than their corresponding ocean currents. My understanding of physics tells me that because of the density difference, wind alone could not move such large volumes of water. So how else could our wind patterns and ocean currents possibly be driven? The answer is diamagnetism, which is a phenomenon very few people have heard of. It has the opposite effect to magnetism, by both magnetic poles repelling a material or substance which is diamagnetic. Surprisingly, water is diamagnetic, as can be seen from this simple experiment. This glass vial is filled with water and being pushed along by magnetism alone. So it is easy to see that Earth's own magnetic field must have great effect on our ocean currents, and even more on our saturated atmosphere and cloud formations. Here, a bloom of plankton highlights a large ocean eddy at the southern tip of South America. It is around 40 miles across and clearly shows its influence on the surrounding cloud formations. As it is a general conception that Earth's core is predominantly iron, it comes as no surprise that in the late 90s a small group of scientists found that Earth's core was a single, large, hexagonal crystalline structure. They also discovered it was rotating faster than Earth's lithosphere in an easterly direction. On March the 27th, 2007, the Cassini space mission sent back images of this bizarre hexagon shape from around Saturn's North Pole. It has puzzled scientists ever since it was received. The hexagon appears to have remained fixed with Saturn's rotation rate and axis ever since Voyager first glimpsed it 26 years ago. It is reported to be a wind and cloud formation racing around the pole at high speed. Earth too has high-speed winds racing around its poles. These are its jet streams. This second graphic has been produced from data gathered in 1995 and shows Earth's northern jet stream. It will be very difficult for anyone to deny there is a distinct similarity between Earth and Saturn's hexagons. Rapid movement of the magnetic pole northwards from the American continent appears to be affecting many aspects of our weather system. The trade winds and tides are moving northwards on the western side of our planet, and many of our animal species are moving with them. These charts show the increase in CO2 and temperature levels over the past 150 years. I would like to add a further chart showing the velocity of Earth's magnetic north pole spanning that same period. This third chart shows an undeniable physical process that correlates exactly with recent temperature increases. My conclusion: pollution by man by no means causes the sort of disruption to our planet that we are experiencing at this present moment. I suggest Earth's core has a distinct wobble, of which its historic path has been recorded within global CO2 and weather data, and that its more recent precession has been recorded in the historic path of Earth's magnetic poles. It is secular variation, or movement of Earth's magnetic field, that is causing global warming by pushing along its oceans and saturated atmosphere. And as this magnetic field is moving rapidly in an unusual direction at this very moment, one can imagine why we are having this temporary disruption to our planet. My guess is that this period of global warming will reverse once the magnetic North Pole passes the geographic North Pole, whereupon it should slow down towards Siberia. By this time, and since the beginning of the last century, it would have covered a swing of around 40 degrees, that is 1/9 of the circumference of our planet. But on arrival at its destination, Earth's weather patterns will continue to be different, as the magnetic equator, which is the fastest moving area of Earth's magnetic field, would also have moved some 40 degrees. Magnetism is hard to master, hard to measure, and because we cannot see it, it is so very easy to ignore. This fascinating physical process is initiated in the hottest and most hostile area of our planet, and yet it is happening quietly beneath our feet.